of Patanjali. Today is going to be a little shorter than previously because I keep going over and I have to make up some of that time. So it'll be shorter. I want to just go through some of the couplets, they're not always couplets, they're the sutras, what I characterized before in my previous lecture as bullet points, because I see the Yogasutra as a sort of outline for teaching, comparable to a PowerPoint presentation before the existence of PowerPoint, of course. Anyway, so in this lecture, I just want to go through interpreting some of the lines of the Yoga Sutra. In doing that, I'm going to rely on three texts, one of which you have. It's this Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, Chip Hartranft, which is freely available on the internet, and which is a pretty good translation, I think. I think surprisingly good, and I chose it off of the internet because it gives you the Sanskrit also with a gloss on the Sanskrit, which is very valuable. I'm not really happy with the fact that he translates samadhi at all, because I'd rather just leave it as samadhi, and that's the way I'm going to refer to it. It's the highest point of realization. He translates it as integration. Other people translate it in different ways, and it's never very clarifying to translate it. But basically, if you try to import a non-yoga concept as the equivalent of samadhi, you're just going to, it's just misleading. That this is not a particular issue with Hartranft. It's basically an issue with almost every translator. Only an occasional translator leaves the word untranslated as a technical term that you have to learn from the Yoga Sutra itself. A second text I'm going to be using is just, you can see here, a TypeScript that I've worked up where I integrate observations of my own with translations by Barbara Stoller Miller and Georg Feuerstein. But I think the best overall I was going to give you a copy of that, but I've decided not to because except for a few points that I'm going to go over it, I don't think it's substantially better than the Hartranft, and it's better for you to just stick to one. But if you did want to get another one, this Edwin F. Bryant, North Point Press, 2009 edition, you can see it's enormous. This is the text itself. It can fit on just a few pages. The text of the Yoga Sutra. And this is with commentary and explication and summary of the tradition of commentary and so on. This comes to 600 pages. Bryant is a professor at Rutgers and does a really, really good job, I think, with the Yoga Sutra. I don't always agree with him, but he's outstanding. I didn't get it for the class for the simple reason that it would be crazy to have you buy this big book and only basically read the text. It's, the text of the Yoga Sutra itself, which is just a few pages. So, because we just don't have time to read 600 pages just on the Yoga Sutra. So anyway, but I'll be referring to some of his translations as we go through some passages here. Okay. So I want to start out at the beginning The first line is simply now the teachings of yoga. Atha Yoganushasanam. Now the teaching of yoga. I mean, it's just basically saying, here we go. So the first substantive line is yoga chitta vritti nirodha. What is yoga? Yoga, ignore the process of yoking. That might be right, but it's controversial whether yoga should be understood as yoking, unifying, or whatever. People disagree on that. And it's fine to conceive of it that way. The problem is if you conceive of yoga as yoking, it makes most sense in an Advaita Vedanta practice where you're linking the Atman with the Brahman. But in Patanjali, you're not doing that, so it seems a little odd. Anyway, the crucial part is chitta vritti nirodha. Instead of consciousness, I'm going to go with thought for chitta. Consciousness seems to me a little misguided here because consciousness makes it seem as if what you're talking about is the observer consciousness. And in fact, you're not reining in movements of observer consciousness. You're reining in movements of mind or thought. Manas would be mind, so I wouldn't translate it as mind, but of what is observed. And it's by reining those in, by stilling, ceasing or restricting those, that you achieve self-realization. So again, you have this situation where observer consciousness, Purusha, is observing mind, intellect, thought, and so on as an object. And because of the gunas, that object is continually changing. It's continually turning. It's continually in movement. It's dynamic because the gunas are dynamic. They're in constant dynamic interaction. And so the observer consciousness is seeing or experiencing these twisting turnings of thought. Again, I think he's wrong to say consciousness here. And what yoga does is it restrains that, it stills that, it calms that. So I wouldn't say yoga is to still the patterning of consciousness. I'd say yoga is the restraining of the turnings of thought, or stilling of the stirrings of thought. So what happens when you still the turnings of thought? Well, then the one that sees, the witness, abides or appears in its own essence. Or I would rather say svarupe, rupa. Sva is self, SVA, and rupe is just an inflected form of rupa. Rupa is form, so its own form. So once you've stilled the turnings of thought, then observer consciousness appears in its own form. So yoga is the restraining of the stilling of the turnings of thought. Then the observer appears in its own form, or his or her own form. It's genderless, of course, because gender is a property of the observed, of the object, the guna turning prakriti. It's not a property of Purusha. So you still the object, and so once you've stilled or restrained the object, you're able to recognize your true self. Your true self, the Purusha, will appear in its own form rather than appearing to you mistakenly in the form of the churning gunas of thought that you, again, mistakenly identify as yourself. what I just said, mistakenly identified as yourself, is what is represented in the next line, vritti sarupyam itaratra. Otherwise, the observer consciousness takes itself to be the turnings of thought. It takes it identifies itself with the turnings of thought. So again, it's sort of like you're watching a movie and there's like a point of view shot, a traveling point of view shot. The camera is moving and something jumps in front of the camera and you leap back as if you've been attacked. But of course you haven't. It's just something going on the movie screen. But you have unreflectively identified with that, the dynamics of that situation. And the idea is the same here, with the difference that instead of a movie screen, you have the turnings of thought in Prakriti, which is what you think you are. So it's, this body here that I think I am, and what that body is seeing, what it's observing, what it's thinking. And so, again, the situation mapped out in these three lines is simply that, to put it in a slightly different order, initially, the Purusha mistakenly identifies itself with these turnings of thought. Then, through the practice of yoga, it stills those turnings of thought. It takes control and reins in those turnings of thought. And once those have been stilled so that you're no longer distracted and confused by them, you being the Purusha can appear to you in its own form, and it's as the true self. I'm going to skip a few lines here. There are, I might mention the 5, the distinction between Klishta and Aklishta. This is a distinction between turnings of thought that are troublesome and those that are not. Some turnings of thought are going to move you further towards rajas and tamas. Some are going to move you further toward sattva. And so at any given moment on your yogic, in your yogic development, a particular turning can be harmful or helpful. A turning, if you're mired in tamas and rajas, then any turning of thought that inclines you toward sattva is actually helpful. Similarly, as you'll learn later on, as you practice yoga, according to the Yogasutra, as you practice yoga, as you become more adept at it, you build up memories of restraining thought. Memories are not simply things that you recall, what are called in contemporary cognitive science episodic memories, things that, like remembering what you did yesterday, an image of something you saw earlier today or whatever. Those are episodic memories. You have a whole range of other memories, particularly skills memories. So remembering how to do something, how to ride a bicycle is a memory. It isn't, it's an implicit memory, not an explicit one. You don't think, okay, well, now I lift my leg over the bicycle and now I push with my right leg on the right pedal. You don't think through that. You remember how to ride a bicycle means to be able to get on a bicycle and ride it. And those sorts of skill memories are built up through yogic practice so that the memories can help you to, for example, concentrate your thought in dharana, in concentration, or to develop a meditative practice in dhyana. And again, those would be turnings of thought that are helpful. They're turnings of thought that are helpful or beneficial, in the sense that thus they're aklishta rather than klishta, in the sense that they will help you advance along the path towards self-realization, towards samadhi, and thus toward moksha, ultimate release. On the other hand, it's important, as we'll see as we get on further, it's important to remember that ultimately you have to still and then remove yourself from all turnings of thought. Ultimately, even the beneficial turnings of thought are a hindrance, but they can be used, so to speak, as tools, and they can be important tools along the way. So let's go on to 12. And again, throughout what he refers to as patterning of consciousness, I'm going to refer to as turnings of thought. Consciousness seems to me a really unfortunate choice here. And patterning is just weird because the point isn't that you've isolated a pattern in thought. It's that the thought keeps changing. It's a very odd sort of translation. I don't know why he chose that. So both practice and non-reaction are required to still the patterning of consciousness. And again, I would say the turnings of thought. So in this sort of composite translation that I put together, I wrote, restraint of the turnings of thought comes through practice and dispassion. Non-reaction is a kind of weird translation, but it's okay. As you see here, what he's translating that way is vairagya bham, which is, he himself lists dispassion as the first meaning, and that's the way it's usually translated. I think probably of the three things he lists here, non-attachment comes closest to what the aim is. The reason it's not usually translated non-attachment is that that's what you're aiming for, but you don't necessarily achieve it. So anyway, the point is, the idea here is that you should, if you want to restrain or still the turnings of thought, you need to do two things. You need to have you need to practice abhyasa. You need to just do stuff over and over and over again because you become what you do. And you have to do it with a certain degree of detachment. You have to do it with a calm, reflective attitude, not passionately. You have to do it in a relaxed manner, so to speak. Otherwise, you won't achieve the stilling of the turnings of thought, and thus you won't achieve the recognition of the true self, because Purusha will not appear in its own form. Okay. Practice is the sustained effort to rest in stillness. He says that stillness. It just means the stillness that is pursued through this practice. I have practice as exertion to maintain stability. I chose stability drawing on these other translators, Feuerstein and Miller, in part to prefigure the actual meditative practice where you literally have to remain still or steady. You literally have to remain stable. But I think stillness here is actually arguably a better translation because even in the yogic practice, in the practice of sitting, the meditative practice, you have to maintain, the stability you have to maintain is really a form of stillness. So still is a pretty good translation here. The stillness is also, stability doesn't extend well to the idea of dispassion, whereas stillness does. Dispassion could be understood as a sort of stillness, a stillness of desire or engagement or whatever. It's not that you are not doing anything. You're certainly doing things. You're practicing yoga. And again, as you recall from the previous lecture, to practice yoga means to do things in ordinary life and to do things in special meditative practice. But you have to do all of them dispassionately, and that is well represented by the idea of stillness. Although, as Hartranft acknowledges, stability or steadiness is, actually steadiness is a pretty good translation there too. You have to practice with steadily, which would imply with the same degree of concentration and commitment day after day. This practice becomes firmly rooted when it is cultivated skillfully and continuously for a long time. The advice here is basically, this requires commitment. You have to know beforehand that you're going to be doing this for a long time. You have to not give up. You have to keep engaging in the practice. My translation, again, drawing on others, was, it becomes firm as the earth when it is continued for a long time in the right manner. Skillfully is a little odd. I mean, it's, as you see, satkara, skillfully or in the right way, in the right manner is what I had used. In the right manner is vague. It doesn't really tell you what the right manner is. But in my construal of the way the Yogasutra operates, the right manner means you pay attention to your guru. The guru says, no, you're sitting in the wrong way. Your leg is like this. No, you're shifted. Keep your spine in this way. No, you're screwing up the breathing. Do the breathing in this other way. The guru continually corrects you. The teacher attends to what you're doing and guides you in the right way. And that's the reason I take it to be vague here. It's vague because, again, these are sort of teaching notes. You're not supposed to, they're not intended to be used solely on their own. Skillfully, in contrast, would seem to me to imply that you have some sort of skills that other people don't have, or maybe I don't or you don't, but someone else has them, and that those skills would enable one, maybe neither of us, but somebody else, to achieve self-realization. And I don't think that's what it's getting at. I don't think it's saying that, you might have the skills or you might not. I think it's saying that you should pay attention to the yoga teacher. So let's see. I think it's interesting that both Hartranft and other translators pick up on this earth metaphor here, rooted or stable as the earth, which is a kind of, in part, the metaphor is in part drawing just on the image of sitting in meditation, even though it applies much more broadly than just to the meditative practice part. Okay. So we had restraint of the turnings of thought comes through practice and dispassion. Practice is the exertion to maintain stability or stillness, actually, I think is better. It becomes firm as the earth or wet-rooted when it is continued for a long time and in the right manner. So these are all, even though they allude to dispassion, they focus on practice. The next line turns explicitly to dispassion or vairagya. All right, his translation first is, as for dispassion, again, non-reaction seems like a weird translation to me. And again, vairagyam, dispassion, he has listed as the first translation. As for dispassion, one can recognize that it has been fully achieved when no attachment arises in regard to anything at all, whether directly perceived or learned. That's generally a good translation, and it does indicate why non-attachment would not be the best translation for vairagyam, because then the sentence would simply be, you can recognize you've achieved non-attachment when you achieve non-attachment. The idea of the sentence is that as you practice, seeking to engage in your daily activities or your meditative activities, seeking to engage in them in a dispassionate way, you will see that this is successful to the extent that you do not feel desire for any material objects. And the last part means whether you have seen the material objects yourself or have merely learned about them. This is, I envision this, here's the way that, again, drawing on these others, I had translated, dispassion is mastery through knowledge of not thirsting for objects seen or heard about. So once you've achieved knowledge of Purusha specifically, then you will no longer desire things, again, either things that are around you, and if you envision yourself in the Vanaprastha stage, the third stage of life, having retreated to the forest, to the ashram, to the hermitage, you don't see much around. You don't see like jewels and wealth and so on around you, for example. There aren't many temptations of artha or kama in your immediate vicinity, but of course you could hear about them or think about them. But if you practice seeking a dispassionate form of practice, and you do it for a long time, and you're continuous and you're devoted, eventually you won't experience desirous feelings, whether you encounter wealth or a desirable, a pleasurable object, or you just hear about them, or come to think about them without perceiving them directly. And again, that you may remember a principle of samsara, of rebirth, is that one of the main, or the reason that you're reborn, that you're continually drawn back into this painful cycle of death and rebirth, according to this system of thought, is precisely because you are attached to the material world. That attachment leads to you continually being reborn. And it's only when you have freed yourself from that attachment that you are no longer sort of seduced back into the material world and can exist in the true form, your true form, in this case, your true form as Purusha, in Advaita Vedanta, your true form as Atman, which is Brahman. In any case, whichever approach you take, whichever view you take, metaphysical view you take on that issue, the idea of being reborn, the idea of the pain and suffering of samsara is inseparable from attachment to the material world. Okay. When the ultimate level of dispassion has been reached, pure awareness, well, actually, non-reaction isn't totally off the mark, because the idea of vairagya is dispassion makes it sound like it refers only to attraction. But in fact, it refers to either attraction or repulsion. You don't feel disgusted or desirous. And so non-reaction does have the advantage of indicating both. You neither have a reaction of feeling repulsed toward an object or feeling desire or attraction toward the object. You're, in effect, indifferent to it. At least indifferent in an ego-focused way, as is clear elsewhere in the Yogasutra, and as turns up in Buddhism and other tendencies, other schools. Compassion can be valuable. Compassion can be consistent with self-realization. But egocentric feelings cannot. So indifference wouldn't really. When I was saying what I was saying before about non-reaction working well, it occurred to me that maybe indifference would be even better. But the problem with indifference is that indifference would seem to exclude compassion, and maybe that's less likely to occur with non-reaction. So maybe non-reaction is okay as a translation. It does have some advantage over dispassion. In any case, when an ultimate level of non-reaction has been reached, pure awareness can clearly see itself as independent from the fundamental qualities of nature. And if you didn't read the Sanskrit, I hope you would still have been able to figure out that the fundamental qualities of nature is a translation of guna. The idea here is that when you ultimately have no attachment to Prakriti at all, then your true self, Purusha, is able to see Purusha, is able to see itself again in its own form, Svarupa, as we saw in the earlier, which was it, 3? Yeah, 1.3. Because it's that attachment to the material object that leads to the confusion of Purusha, our confusion in identifying our true self, not in its own form, in its Svarupa, in its actual nature as Purusha, its actual existence as Purusha. Instead, that attachment leads us to identify ourselves with the object we're observing, the mind, the body, the intellect even, all of which are composed of the gunas. And it's only when we're detached from all of that that we can recognize that we ourselves are not of the gunas. We're not Prakriti, but Purusha. Okay. 17 and 18 are a little are complicated. And I never really understood them until I looked at, or I never really understood them. That makes it sound as if I'm confident that I understand them now, and I'm not entirely confident that I understand them now. But I feel more confident that I understand them having consulted Bryant's version. So we can first look at heart ramps. At first, the stilling process is accompanied by 4 kinds of cognition: analytic thinking, insight, bliss, or feeling like a self. Later, after one practices steadily to bring all thought to a standstill, these 4 kinds of cognition fall away, leaving only a store of latent impressions in the depth memory. And what is he translating as depth memory? I guess it's shisha. The important point is the latent impressions are sanskaras. Sanskaras are any memory, they're usually translated as memory traces. They're any sort of memory traces, and they're the sorts of things I was referring to earlier as skills memories. They aren't only skills memories, but they're the sorts of memories that both enable you to do things. They're like a combination of skills memories and habits. They're or dispositions. They're the sorts of things you can do, you acquire the capacity to do, and they're also the sorts of things that you become inclined to do that become habitual for you. Those are the best ways to think of the memory traces called sanskars. This is the way that Bryant translates these. I don't know if you'll find it any more illuminating than Hartranft. But we'll go back to the Sanskrit in a moment too. I've referred to sanskara. Within the Sanskrit, the other thing that I want to address is asmita. That is, again, egoism, a sense of I, of ego. I would avoid, it literally can be referred to as a sense of self, but I would avoid referring to it as a sense of self because I'd rather reserve the word self for Purusha or Atman when we're talking in that idiom. And in order to distinguish the ego as something that isn't the self. So the idea of sense of self here is that you think that something is yourself, but it isn't. And again, what I would prefer to do is refer to that thing, that aspect of prakriti that you confuse with yourself. I would prefer to refer to that aspect of prakriti as ego and just confine it to that so that we don't get mixed up in talking about selves, excuse me. Okay, so Brian says samadhi consists of the consecutive mental stages of absorption with physical awareness, absorption with subtle awareness, absorption with bliss, and absorption with the sense of I-ness. So what he's saying, well, and then let's go on, that's 17, and then let's go on to 18. And this might give us some sense of what's going on in this complicated passage. So that's the particular sort of samadhi, what is referred to, I left out a word in his, in Brian's translation. Cognitive samadhi consists of the consecutive mental stages of absorption with physical awareness, absorption with subtle awareness, absorption with bliss, and absorption with the sense of I-ness or asmita. And this is what Hartranft translates as: at first, the stilling process is accompanied by 4 kinds of cognition. So this would be cognitive samadhi: analytical thinking, insight, bliss, or feeling like a self. Very different translation, but we'll return to it in a moment. 18, Bryant, non-cognitive samadhi is preceded by cultivating the determination to terminate all turnings of thought. In this state, only latent impressions, sanskaras, remain. Okay, so the key point here is that Patanjali is drawing a distinction between what he calls cognitive and non-cognitive samadhi, cognitive and non-cognitive realization. And clearly non-cognitive realization is superior to cognitive realization. And therefore we have to figure out what cognitive realization is. Cognitive realization is realization that is somehow muddied up, confused by thought. And again, remember, thought is a property of Prakriti. So it's, again, subjected to turnings. So as you're advancing, you begin to get a greater sense of your true self, your Purusha. You get this this sense of self is developing in the course of your yogic practice. But initially, you're going to think about this using terms, concepts, ideas, and so on that are part of ordinary life. And these terms, concepts, and so on are part, therefore, of Prakriti. Therefore, they're part of thought. And I don't think we have to worry. I mean, this isn't an ashram. This isn't a hermitage. I don't think we have to worry about the stages of analytic thinking, insight, and bliss, or absorption with physical awareness, absorption with subtle awareness, absorption with bliss. The general idea is that, for example, when you're meditating, you have some sense of you as Purusha, but you're in the physical awareness, you're aware of your body. In the subtle awareness, you're aware of your mind and your thought processes. In the bliss, you're really, to put it crudely, you're really excited about the progress you're making in yoga practice. In the stage of asmita, all that remains is you're still thinking of yourself as a self. You're still thinking of yourself as an ego, as this material being. You still haven't escaped that. Now, one thing that might help clarify this is to note that everything we're doing here, we're nowhere near samadhi, but we're very cognitive. We're talking about this in words, we're thinking about it in concepts, we're trying to communicate about it. It's all abstract and cognitive. And that abstract cognitive character is gradually attenuated, but it still remains to some degree in the various stages that we move through in our progress toward full samadhi. And that full samadhi, well, actually the next stage isn't quite full samadhi. The next stage is samadhi realization that is non-cognitive, where we just have the experience. But the experience is still modified by the sanskaras. So, for example, as our practice builds up our skill at maintaining dhyana, or meditation, it builds up our skills at maintaining meditation, and it may build them up to such an extent that we have moments when we are no longer cognizing our experience of Purusha. We're no longer thinking, I am having this experience of Purusha. We're just experiencing the Purusha. But those moments are fragmentary, they're separated, they are in fact constrained by this sequence of sanskaras, the sequence of skill and habit memories that we've built up. And again, you have to overcome those to fully free yourself, because those still are tying you to prakriti. Those two are still tying you to thought. And you still have to liberate yourself from those to extend, first to reach Dharma Mega Samadhi, the experience of being in this life, what's called Jivan Mukti, Jivan Mukti, Mukti meaning one who has achieved moksha. Jivan means in life, so one who has achieved liberation in life. That means that you, as soon as you die, you will be liberated from samsara, the cycle of birth and death. But of course, since you're still in life, you haven't been fully liberated. But being Jivan Mukti, having Dharma Mega Samadhi, self-realization surrounding you like a cloud, like a mist, it becomes the atmosphere in which you breathe, even though you're still alive. That existence in ordinary life is the highest stage, according to yogic thought, the highest stage that you can reach, the greatest approximation to self-realization prior to actually leaving the material world. Okay. I don't want to go a lot longer because one thing that's going on for this class is there's a student presentation, so that's to take half the class, and I've already gone over half of the class, and I still have time left over from going over in previous lectures. And of course, next time we have to get to the Bhagavad Gita. Okay, I'm going to pause and just to figure out what I want to add here in the last little bit, what I want to make sure we get to. Maybe we should try to at least finish part one, the section one. So let me see what I should go through there. Yeah, I definitely want to add 1.42 and 43 because, again, many commentators on the Yoga Sutra have remarked on the weird organization of the text. And again, they attribute it largely to they explain it largely by the idea that the text is a compilation of different source texts, and that makes sense. But the order is still kind of weird. I remark on it now because this division between cognitive and non-cognitive that we've just been talking about in 1.17 and 1.18 recurs importantly at 1.42 and 1.43. So why this big separation, I have no idea. It's not at all clear. So let's go to 1.42 and 43. So long as conceptual or linguistic knowledge pervades this transparency. Let me see what he said about the transparency. Okay. Transparency is basically being, how did I translate that? When the turnings decrease, the grasper, the process of grasping, and the object grasped coincide. So what he's translating as transparency is, again, just the idea that Purusha appears in its own form. So the metaphor of grasper, grasping, and object grasped are all identical, means that the Purusha grasps is the grasper engaged in grasping Purusha, grasping in the sense of do you grasp this concept, or do you grasp what I'm trying to communicate? So it's transparent in the sense that the self, the true self, sees this true self. In other words, Purusha appears in Svarupa, in its own form. Again, the goal of yoga practice, as indicated already in the third, the observer appearing in its own form, in the third line of the first part of the Yogasutra, as we went over. So, so long as conceptual or linguistic knowledge pervades this transparency, it is called coalescence with thought. The way I had that's a good translation. It's except for transparency, which is kind of weird. But anyway, if mixed with words, meanings, and conceptual knowledge, then the coincidence is cognitive. The coincidence of self and object, of Purusha as observer and Purusha as observed. So again, this is just returning to the idea of the different stages of samadhi. Samadhi being the self-realization, ultimate self-realization, and self-realization means Purusha recognizing itself in its own form rather than confusing itself with the material world. That self-recognition of Purusha in its own form can either be mediated cognitively or not, or mediated or not. If it's mediated by concepts, by meanings, by words, conceptual or linguistic knowledge in Hartranft's translation, then it's called samadhi it's called cognitive samadhi, or samadhi with cognition. Obviously, I'm using the word thought for chitta, so I wouldn't use thought here. I don't think that's the best way of putting it. It's not the traditional way. Commonly, it's referred to as cognitive samadhi and non-cognitive samadhi. And non-cognitive, again, transcends cognition. Cognition means that you're still thinking about it, labeling it, and thinking about it and labeling it, including labeling it as me, thus through asmita or ahankara, the two words that I've noted already are used in Sanskrit for I-ness or egoism or egocentrism. That would be one of the cognitive interlopers, so to speak, between self and self-realization. Even as you're coming to realize yourself, it's still harmed, it's still limited by these concepts, which are, again, part of mind or intellect or thought, chitta, and thus subject to the turnings of thought, and thus part of prakriti. And again, to have full self-realization, you have to transcend even those concepts, and that's what you get in referred to in 1.43. At the next stage, called coalescence beyond thought, or in other translations, non-cognitive samadhi. Objects cease to be colored by memory, now formless, only their essential nature shines forth. A lot of people go with formless here, but and they know the Sanskrit infinitely better than I do, and maybe Shunya does suggest that in the Sanskrit. But I'm inclined to read the Shunya Vartha, that's this here, Svarupa Shunya Vartha. Maybe I'm wrong in terms of the Sanskrit, I don't know. Conceptually, it seems to me that it's more consistent with what's going on in the course of the whole text to translate this as in samadhi without cognition, the Purusha appears in its own form, Svarupa. That's consistent. That's exactly what is said in 1.3. It does in 1.3. It does not say without form. It says in its own form. And this, if it says that the ultimate is for Purusha to appear without form, that would be a direct contradiction between 143 and 1.3. And I'm disinclined to believe that. I would group Shunyavardha together, not as meaning that it is, Shunya is void, and Artha is again that polysemous word. It means many different things. And here I would take it to mean meaning, or, because again, one of the meanings of Artha is meaning. And so I would, since what we're talking about here is, what Patanjali is talking about here is first cognitive samadhi, cognitive self-realization, which is self-realization that is shaped, oriented, understood by words, concepts, meanings. You would expect the next stage to be the Purusha in its own form, void of meanings, concepts, and so on. And Shunyavardha certainly means void of meanings. So I take it that it's not that it's void of form, it's that it's in its own form, void of meaning. In other words, you simply directly experience Purusha. Purusha directly experiences Purusha as in its own form, without constraints, shapes, guidance, orientation, determined by Artha, thus not determined by meaning, language, concept, which are again all a matter of Prakriti. Let's see. Well, just to finish out one and take us to a full hour, and we'll stop like 15 minutes before the hour. I mean, again, 15 minutes before the usual 75 minutes, because again, the class presentation for the student presentation should account for about half of the class period, which would be 37 minutes, not 15. So again, I'm going over. But just to quickly go to the last two. Oh, I'm not there. 50 and 51. This is something that I've referred to before. It's related to Klishta and Aklishta. Remember, I mentioned that I've repeatedly noted that practice can give rise to inclinations that further, that benefit your yogic achievements later on, so that you can develop, for example, in dharana, concentration, or dhyana, meditation, you can develop, or even in cognitive samadhi, right? You develop memories, memory traces, sanskaras, tendencies, habits, skills, and skills actually make sense there because they're skills you're acquired. That's a different, using skills differently than Hartranft did in his translation that I objected to earlier. You can develop these in such a way that they affect your meditation, but instead of affecting it by distracting you, they affect your meditation and your yogic practice by aiding you, by facilitating your concentration and your meditation. And so that, though again, you have to ultimately overcome even those sanskaras, because those are still prakritic. They're still part of the material world. They're not purusha. But as a means of achieving yogic goals, they're a necessary tool. They're a necessary, and they lead to a necessary step. And that necessary step includes cognitive samadhi. And so this is referred to in the last two statements of part one, the first 150. Your practice is going to generate latent impressions, sanskaras, skills, habits, and so on, that prevent or inhibit the activation of other impressions. So in other words, as you practice stilling the turnings of thought, you will build up sanskaras that themselves help to rein in the turnings of thought. But that is not the final stage. To go on to the last point in part one. When even these cease to arise, when you've overcome even these sanskaras, when you no longer need the help of previous training, and thus of the sanskaras resulting from previous practice, you no longer need that aid to still the turnings of thought. When the turnings of thought are completely stilled, then you have what's called seedless samadhi. Seeded samadhi is samadhi that you experience at a given moment, but it still has seeds of attachment, of identification with the turnings of thought, and those seeds develop later into a retreat from samadhi, a sort of backtracking into the ordinary pre-samadhi way of life. And this is when samadhi is intermittent. It isn't constant. You're not yet in the dharma mega samadhi. You're not yet jivan mukta. You're not yet fully liberated even in life, because the seeds, to use the metaphor, they grow into plants and return you the seeds when they burst forth, when they develop, when they grow. They return the turnings of thought that you had only temporarily stilled. And it's and that occurs invariably when you're still in the stage of cognitive samadhi, when you're still in the stage of relying on previous sanskaras. It's only when you no longer have to rely on previous sanskaras that the turning of thought is completely stilled, and genuine seedless samadhi with no further consequences, no possibility of future retreat from samadhi. It's only then that genuine full samadhi occurs, and you are as if you're living in a cloud of your nature is like a cloud of samadhi that surrounds you. You carry it with you wherever you go, even though you're in the material world. You're jivan mukta, you're released, though in life, and you'll be finally released upon death. Okay, so obviously there's a lot more one could discuss in the Yogasutra, but I think that gives you, going through these passages in the first section of the work, combined with my overview of the trajectory of yogic practice that I outlined in the former lecture, I think that gives you a way of going through the rest of the Yoga Sutra on your own and doing so productively. Okay, thank you. And then next time we'll be turning to the Bhagavad Gita.